All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third webinar for those invited to submit final applications to Digitizing Hidden Special Collections and Archives, Amplifying Unheard Voices program. My name is Becca Kwan. I'm a member of the Clear Grants team, and I'll be starting things off today. My fellow program officers, Sharon Burney and Joy Banks, and a couple of our colleagues, Krista Williford, Diane Ramirez, and Allison Pope, are here to help support the meeting. Joy?
Yes. Are you advancing the slides?
Yes.
These will look quite familiar to anybody who has already been on our first two calls, but we do want to start with just a couple of reminders. We do have a live transcript today, as we have in the past, if you'd like to turn that on. So you can select the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You may have to select more to find that option. You may have noticed, again, that we are using a regular Zoom meeting space instead of the webinar space. So you have control over your own microphones and video. So please be mindful of that and ensure you're muted if you aren't speaking. We know that sitting on camera on Zoom can be exhausting, so do feel free to turn that off during the presentation. At times, you may be invited to unmute or pop up a video for discussion or Q&A. You are also welcome to use the chat for conversation throughout our meeting. To open that, you can hover your mouse towards the bottom of the screen and open it manually. The chat defaults to send a message to everyone, but you may also message individuals directly. This session is being recorded. The slides, Q&A, recording, and transcript will be made available on the Apply for an Award page on our website by the end of this week. So the first two sessions have already been posted there. If you missed last week, yes, all of everything from the first two sessions is posted, and it will be in the same place for this session too.
So as always, our team would like to acknowledge that as residents of the US, we're speaking to you from unceded lands of many Indigenous people. Those of us working at CLEAR are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on their homelands and ask you to join us in acknowledging all Indigenous communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. As CLEAR staff and session co-hosts are introduced in the next few moments, we invite you to do the same in the chat. I see those are already coming in, and I'm so glad. And please share land acknowledgements for the area where you live or work if you would like. May our shared acknowledgement and the program we're speaking about today demonstrate CLEAR's commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism.
Okay, we want to start today with a quick poll to gauge how you're feeling about today's topic of designing a rights, ethics, and reuse plan for digitization project design. So in today's session, you're going to learn more about the skills and strategies you're going to need to complete the following application tasks. First one would be project details, rights, ethics, and reuse. And then upload rights, ethic, and reuse appendices. So beginning, we're going to start with the poll we'd like you to participate in. And we'll pop that up. And the question, let's get the poll going. There we go. How prepared do you feel to develop the application components we're going to discuss? Okay, looks like, yeah.
Excellent. I'll give you a few more seconds.
Looks like somewhat prepared is leading the charge. Okay. That's a great response.
Excellent.
Okay, we'll finish up. And today, at the end of today's session, we're gonna continue. We'll be back at the end of the session to contribute during the question and answer portion. And then we're gonna give you a few reminders as we wrap up. So now I'm gonna turn things over to Dr. Natura Moya. Who's gonna handle the
Hi, thank you.
presentation.
I'm Anna Neruda Moya. I'm the project director of the Indigenous Digital Archive Project. That's a collaborative project of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in collaboration with the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center and the New Mexico State Library. We also do we've also done the partnership with the National Archives for the digitreaties.org project, where you can explore the obligations we've all entered into through historical treaties. You can find me at Anna Neruda. Next slide, please. Okay, so this session is going to focus on introducing some tools you can use when you're drafting your rights, ethics, and reuse section for explaining and justifying the decisions you're making in digitization and access, and helping explore some of those too for your team. Next. We're going to look a little bit at legal obligations, those that are required by law, ethical obligations, those that reflect more on good practice, and we'll discuss access or reuse. We're going to examine some of the established frameworks that you can draw on when you're doing your justification, and then we're going to make sure and leave time for questions and answers, so you can bring detail from what you're working on. Next, please. For preparing your rights, ethics, and reuse statement, we're going to evaluate the legal and ethical concerns that will influence your project. Next, please. Legal considerations, things that are actually defined in statutes. You'll need to be concerned about ownership of material or consent by the owner, about copyright, and potentially about privacy rights as legally defined, depending on your type of repository. Next, please. And I'm going to put some links throughout these slides, and after this session, the slides are going to be available, so you don't have to worry about taking down the links. You'll be able to download the slides and click the links. Legal considerations, if you want to check out how you own the material, confirm that, or you may be entering into a letter of agreement to have the owner consent for you to digitize and make available the material. For copyright, you're going to want to check your deed of gift if you have one. If not, you'll need to kind of search around a little bit and do some assessment of how it is that you have the collection, and maybe look into whether you need to do some searching. What is your due diligence, and sort of outreach to see that you're checking with potential copyright holders for permission. And for copyright, there's a really useful tool started being published at the end of the last century, and it's just been updated last March. So that's the copyright and public domain chart, and that gives you a very clear guide. It deals with both US copyright law, and it has now some resources for works outside of the US also. So that gives you good guidelines. You can look up for each type of material, whether it's a previously published work, manuscript work, even down to architectural drawings. So it's quite a useful tool. Next, please. Privacy rights is legally defined. I'm going to cover laws that the US government has to follow as far as privacy. And you'll see this, one of the most public expressions of it is in viewing documents at the US National Archives. So we'll look at their published regulations about this. For government records, in general, privacy is dependent on the age of the record. They're considered records 75 years or old or older are considered open access. They can be opened sooner if it's known that the individual is deceased. That's just how legal definition of privacy works. There are specific legal protections for personally identifying information and PII and sensitive PII in government records. Next slide, please. We'll look at some of those. So the basic rubric of personally identifying information and sensitive PII is that a subset of PFI that if it's without authorization disclosed could result in substantial harm, embarrassment, inconvenience, or unfairness to an individual. It can be just things like social security's number, driver's license, alien registration number, financial account numbers, biometric identifiers like a fingerprint, etc. Next slide, please. There's other types that if it's combined with some sort of identifier to an individual name or identification number, plus truncated social security number, date of birth, citizenship or immigration status, ethnic or religious affiliation, sexual orientation, criminal history, medical information, things that can be used for common system authentication information like a mother's maiden name. Those would need to be redacted in government documents before the document is allowed to be viewed by people that are not the people in the document or their confirmed heirs. Now, if any of these things, if the person has expressed any of these things publicly, then that information is no longer a worry because it's in the public sphere. So for example, if someone has already been public that they are a Polish cishet woman, that sort of information doesn't need to be redacted from the record. Next, please. And this is from a procedural chart from the US National Archives of how they screen records. So you see the records for less than 75 years old, the list of things that they screen, including, they mentioned photographs where there might be graphic photographs that the release of which could impact on privacy of the subject to surviving family members, witness information, employment information, performance ratings, which are considered opinion and not fact. So they redact that. Any disciplinary actions, alien registration number. Records under 30 years old, they add some additional things to the screening to screen for financial information, credit card numbers, bank account information, if that might appear. And this might come more into concern when you have electronic records. And then they have the green circle there is records less than 12 years old, where they also want to screen for things like phone numbers and address and that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So this is links to the information that I just gave you previously. If you want to review that more or refer to that as you're doing your justification. Next slide, please. An additional category of private records would be school records. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, in the United States applies specifically to schools that receive Department of Education funding. So it's kind of a narrowly defined law, but it gives a general principle that can be useful. So when you look at that, there's a link that shows all kinds of examples of information that would be private and not be allowed to be released without permissions. But not included in that, schools can release directory information such as student's name, address, telephone number, date and place of birth, honors and awards, dates of attendance. So something that's actually kind of in conflict with how the National Archives would screen for more recent records. And even that exemption, parents, and then as students age into 18, they have to be informed that this information is going to be released or published and allowed to opt out to protect their privacy. Next slide, please. So these particular examples that I just gave, they don't apply strictly legally speaking to every institution. They are legal requirements for government, for US government institutions, for example, National Archives, Department of Homeland Security, and for schools receiving funds. But the legal obligation is fairly constrained, but you can take a look at those and see how they might relate to your justifications for what sorts of information you'll be releasing or publishing or restricting based on your records and your communities, your stakeholder communities that are affected. Next slide, please. So ethics. Ethics, of course, go beyond the requirements defined by law to be part of good practice. And back to the applicant handbook, the program is really directing us to look at steps that you will take to evaluate and address potential concerns, especially those that affect people of color and other communities and populations whose work, experience, and perspectives have been insufficiently recognized or unattended. Next slide, please. When in our project with the Indigenous Digital Archives, we use the rubric of respectful online access. That's our guiding principle that's been developed by our team, including our advisory panel. And a particular codification of principles is the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, as a set of best professional practices developed by Native and non-Native practitioners more than 15 years ago. But it has now been officially adopted by the Society of American Archivists and the Association of College and Research Libraries. So that gives you some, it's further justification for working with this set of ethical practices or analogous ethical practices. Next slide, please. You have support for it. There's the specifics and the ethical model of the protocols. The protocols for Native American archival materials, they have unique application because they regard material of and about sovereign Native governments and communities. So that's because these are sovereign entities, nation to nation, government to government. There's a legal basis for various of the protocols about ownership. However, also as protocols for ethical interactions, they can also provide a touchstone or model for interactions between other institutions and historically marginalized communities. So it's a set of best practices that's really worth sitting down with, and that you can take justification from. Next slide, please. Okay, and then detail on about it and examples. There's the link for it. And each topic area includes specific guidelines for action for both libraries and archives and for Native communities. And of course, those are not always separate, but it's useful as you look through the guidelines for action. Next slide, please. Because it is all about building obligations and relationships. And that's the first principle, building relationships of mutual respect. Some examples would be the composition of your project leadership and advisory panels, how you decide and what you decide about what types of items should or should not be available online, working through the questions of, are there things that appear in records that should not be available online, and who should decide, and who should it be available to? Next slide, please. Other areas are striving for balance in content and perspectives. That can mean that you want to do a little bit of collection development, depending on what sort of set of documents or records that you're putting up. You know, sometimes because archives are evidence, and a lot of the things we're working with are evidence. Sometimes we work a lot with records that are records of trauma, you know, records of unjust actions, and it's really useful to look and see what else you want to have available to balance out the collection, to show you know, fuller aspects of life and existence. Or, you know, if your collection is all it just depends, you know, it depends. I mean, sometimes it's used for making sure that you have historically marginalized voices in a set of materials. You know, for example, classically, a lot of documentation about Native communities has been, or that's been, you know, perpetuated in museums, has been by outsiders. And so making sure that you include works by community members, by Native scholars, you know, see what's appropriate to balance out. Accessibility and use, you know, work with your team to determine the types of resources and services that the communities want. Culturally sensitive materials, you know, make sure you have discussions up front about, you know, are there things that should not be published widely, because making things available online is different than just, you know, having them available. Are there things, or are there things that need contextualizing, or are there things that just need to have access restricted? And it's really useful to have those conversations, because usually it points to really good directions. Next slide, please. Another area of action is providing context. They have some specific suggestions that if you're publishing material that may have historical titles with offensive terms, you can add context to say, you know, who created that, you know, who wrote those words in what year, or simply remove the offensive terms and bracket out with, you know, things that would be appropriate, an actual descriptor of the item rather than forefronting the that person's perspective. Providing context can also include appropriately revising historical indexing or subject terms. You know, there's some work going on under various names, including, you know, decolonizing library terms, or just, you know, correcting inaccurate old historical Library of Congress subject terms. So there's a link to work that's been underway for revising terms to make appropriate terms related to the study of African American history, culture, and life through librarians working with the African American Subject Funnel Project to update the Library of Congress terms. Next slide, please. An area of action, Native American intellectual property issues. You know, at the time that they were writing these protocols, you know, about 15 years ago, they talked about consider expanding the idea of moral rights to protect Native American cultural and intellectual property. And now I think, you know, subsequently, I think there's even more support for this, or you know, justification for it, because of the European Union establishing moral rights about intellectual property. The idea being that the creator there's a right that the creator has to how their work is used, you know, to not have it be used grotesquely or in a way that would be against their morality. And so, you know, that's useful when you're talking about things that you know, are not strictly copyright issues, but there is you know, a community intellectual property relationship. Another area of action, the copying and repatriation of records from Native American communities. So sharing, in that case specifically, sharing records from institutions back into communities to make sure people have access to it. Native American research protocols. So that's respecting what Native communities, Native governments have set up for research protocols within their communities, research relating to their communities. So this is analogous to institutional review boards that people who are part of universities work with when they're proposing research. There's also Native governments have proposed or have a protocol, a process for what potential researchers need to do. So, in those cases, it's again about building conversations and learning about the steps that need to be followed. Reciprocal education and training. I think this is one that we can do a lot with in our projects, making sure that projects spread training into stakeholder communities wherever possible, so that becomes one of the products of the project also. And awareness of Native American communities and issues. And this goes back to what does the community want? Where are their priorities? What are their needs? And how can this work support that? And again, the protocols, they center relationships and they are a process. So that's something that would be ongoing throughout the life cycle of your project. Next slide, please. And talking about ethics, in designing projects, another important consideration is, do you have material that may potentially trigger trauma? Again, as a source of evidence, a lot of times, archival information can be very difficult and very, and important for it. And you want to take a look at how will you inform and care for users of the material, and how would you address needs of people who work with the material as part of your project. This is not part of the grant requirements, but as a fellow practitioner in this area, I encourage you, if you have potentially some of these issues, I really encourage you to put this into your planning process as early as possible. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm trying to advance my slides. Next slide, please. This is one example, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They provide some online introduction to this would be something aimed at people using the website. So they give kind of an introduction here that you may have some needs, this is real, you may be triggered by it. And as they say, you are not alone and help is available. Next slide, please. And this is part of the resources on that page, a helpline, grounding breathing exercises that can help you out of the fight-flight mode, and a whole bunch more resources, including resources for culturally specific resources or practices. So, this is something that, depending on your situation, you might link to, you might develop something of your own. So we had sort of planned on this, but in previous projects, we hadn't really planned out the part about, how you're going to care for people that work on the project. And I think that's very important. And we're sort of, been revising to include that, and you can talk with your team, your advisory panel about that, about what's appropriate, if this is relevant to you. It may be the making available culturally specific practices. It may be as simple as providing paid time for whatever that person is going to do to get through it, like whether they're going to be doing psychotherapy or continuing it like sick leave, right? Like we don't usually have that for our folks on our grant project teams, but providing paid time acknowledging that they're going to need to do something to take care of themselves through working with this material. Next slide, please. Okay, access. And Becca, do we want to take a brief break, or do you want to keep going?
We can take a few minutes, maybe we'll say 5 minutes, and then come back and start in on this section. So we'll see everybody at 37 after the hour.
Thank you.
All right, I hope everyone was able to go get a drink or a snack, take a little breather, and now we'll get started again with this second section of the presentation. And just to note, the Q&A section is coming up, so get your questions ready. You can paste them into the chat or pose them using your mic if you'd like once we get there. So just to let you know that that's coming up.
Yes, yes, thank you. Yeah, it's coming up very quick. We'll just do a quick overview on some considerations on access and reuse, and then we'll jump right into questions and answers. I know a lot of this stuff you can talk about it abstractly, but it's really the specifics, you know, and that's what's important. So we'll get to that very soon. So planning for community-centered access. Next slide, please. So you're gonna have kind of two paths. Do legal or ethical concerns mean that you need to provide differential access? Or if no legal or ethical restraints prohibit it, how will you provide and encourage open access and review and reuse? Next slide, please. And here, this is just touching on two of the resources that are in your application handbook as well. Right statements that are easy for people to see and machine readable metadata, meaning that search engines will be able to process what your right statement is. You can have additional annotations, of course, in your notes field or whatever, but here, this is stuff that they've tried to design it so it has the best chance of being paid attention to, is the basic thing. So you have available to you rightstatement.org, ways of expressing knowledge about copyright and reuse status, where you can provide metadata about whether it's in copyright, not in copyright, or whether you don't know. And then also lets you express certain things about reuse of that material, non-commercial reuse permissions, various kinds of permissions. So it's a very useful kind of chart, flow chart about getting to what you want to put onto your material. And then localcontexts.org is the product of a number of years of development now and is continuing. And they've provided traditional knowledge labels or TK labels as ways of providing machine readable metadata and graphical representation for some of the common sorts of access restrictions that might apply to native community material or other types of community material. For example, I just put two examples up there. For example, something that's restricted for access during particular seasons, something that is, you know, only knowledge among women, that kind of thing. And now they also have biocultural labels, excuse me, which are ways of expressing native intellectual property relationship to information about things derived from their traditional homelands, be that knowledge about plants, animals, the geography, etc. And so these are additional ways of expressing protocols for interacting with material. So there's, again, you know, a very useful chart. You can go through and see what you need. And with that, next slide, please. We'll open it up for questions and answers, please.
Awesome. And I think just to sort of put your fantastic presentation into a little bit of context, I think if you've looked through the applicant handbook, you'll see that we ask questions that you'll want to check if any of the restrictions or situations will apply to your materials. So we're happy to talk through any questions you have about that section of the application or the question that we ask you to answer: what rights or ethical concerns apply to this project? Anna went over a lot of those But if you have specific questions about your particular materials or what you might want to include in answer to that question, we're happy to talk through those. Yeah, so I guess I can read off this first one in the chat. If we're operating in Canada with Canadian material, should we follow Canadian privacy standards, or will it be necessary to meet both Canadian and American criteria?
I can go ahead and take that one since it's kind of specific. If you are dealing with collections that are, you should deal with the standards that are specific to wherever the collections live. That would be my recommendation to you. So if you're doing a cross-border project that involves both US and Canadian organizations, then you will likely need to consider the laws in both countries. But if you're exclusively dealing with collections in Canada, with organizations in Canada, then we wouldn't expect you to abide by any US laws. You'll just need to reference the IP agreement, which we haven't talked about quite yet, but that is sort of the end point of all of this when we're thinking about the legal issues.
Thank you. The next question is about the voice print noted on a slide early in the presentation. Would someone's voice be considered identifiable? Are there protections we should be taking in this regard? And maybe I'll throw that one to Anna to see if you have any more information.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, number one, if it's historical, you know, you don't need to worry about it because it's you know, there's no current, you know, if it's someone who's deceased, there's no worry about like manufacturing their voice to have them act now, I would say, if that makes sense. So basically, if they're historical records, I wouldn't worry about it. If they're contemporary things like living people, you should probably have some kind of agreement that they sign that gives you permission to use recordings of them, if possible. And if that doesn't cover things you need to consider for your question, feel free to put another question in.
All right. The next question says, we're going to be working mainly with African American church materials. This can sometimes include baptismal records. Am I right in assuming that this is PII?
Is that for me?
Let's have you start.
Okay. Yeah. So off the top of my head, I would say that it's probably not strictly speaking PII because it's not a government record, and it's a public act. If you know what I'm saying, you know, it's people going to the church and before the church proclaiming, these are our relations. I still think it would be, and part of it's going to depend on, or I would consider the age of the records, whether they're you know, from recent decades or older. And I would just, you know, I'd have conversations, you know, if you can have that conversation with the church leadership, you know, I think that can be very helpful because usually, very often people just want, you know, particularly with historical information, very often people want to have that information available and be able to, you know, work on family histories and that kind of thing for it. But it'd be good to have that conversation because if it's completely completely published online, then anybody can start going through it and anybody can work through it. And they may or may not want that. But so it could be there could be situations where people want to have like restricted things to the community and then just share maybe some overarching information more widely. For example, in a collaborative project we're working with, the Saginaw Chippewa tribe is working on getting digital copies of boarding school records from their historic boarding school. And so they very much want that information. They want it available within the community. And then they're also going to be generating some reports, some, kind of research reports. That they will share more widely, but they're not going to share the records themselves.
And the next question.
And just to piggyback on that, Anna, that example right there where you are setting up different sets of access for different communities of users, that's an example of the tiered access or differentiated access, or however you want to think about it. So that was like a really good example of what we're thinking about when you're creating community-centered access for this project.
Next question looks like, as the above question, among the records we are working with our World Church in partnership with USAID, records of refugees during the Vietnam War. Could these be an issue with PI? Anna, would you expand on that too?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So that could be tough. I could see there being tough things in those records. So, again, like PII, if the record is not coming from the government itself, the organization is not bound by the PII restrictions. That can mean that you have even more of an ethical obligation to kind of take a look at what might be there and what the impacts might be. The sort of age of the records might be something that you want to take a look at. Have you crossed the 75-year rule? I used to work, one of the places I've worked with records is, at the National Archives with the historic immigration files that were kept on people of Chinese descent. And there's the alien registration files and all that kind of thing. And, so again, there's information on there that's, intense interest historically, but there's also can be very difficult things. Because it was the government, it was strictly based on the 75-year division, or if the subjects in the records were deceased. If it was an older record, it could be open. If it was sooner, then it had to only be accessed by the person or their documented heirs, or a redacted version could be released that it contained no personally identifying information, meaning that you could see the record, but you would not know who it was about. It's a painstaking process to go through and make sure you take out all kinds of personally identifying information. So you're going to have to talk about what the goals and access to the records are, whether it's going to include people being able to research specific individuals, such as in family history, or whether it's going to be redacted so that people can research without without it being able to be connected to individuals. And that can be something that, you work with your stakeholder communities. You can create, again, kind of tiered access, for people. Well, I guess it would be tough because it's not like it's a tribal group, where there's a community, identified community. It's a group of people that think, a thing happened to. But it could be that you're providing access to redacted records, but then people can get their family's record. Could be an approach.
Yeah, I think one of the main things that our reviewers look for is this exact kind of discussion that you raise these questions about the materials. Are there any issues with PII? That you've done a little bit of research into that answer, and that you have an appropriate plan in place for whatever that answer is.
That brings us to the next question. Working with Indigenous materials, part of our process involves a review by tribal partners to identify and potentially culturally sensitive material. But we don't know at this point which collections or items that might include. So is there any specific guidance on how we should be communicating this in the application?
So it sounds like, and let me know if this reflects your situation. It's, well, I'll talk about from a process that we undertook, and a process that we undertook with our advisory panel as we identified records related to Native communities, of interest to Native communities, that were unlikely to have potentially culturally sensitive material in them, but that if we find it, we don't express it online. We don't publish it online. So is that the kind of situation that you're talking about, where you've sort of evaluated the series or this, the collections, and you don't think it's going to come up, or I mean, overall for both the material, or do you still need to evaluate the various material to see if there's whole series that might be sensitive?
I'm just going to chime in over audio because it's quicker than taking a response. The specific collections and series and folders that have been requested have already undergone as much review by the traveler collaborators as possible. I think it's likely that it will be a very, very small percentage of it that may have sensitivity, or various types of sensitivities attached to it. So likely minimal. We don't want to rule it out entirely and say yes, everything will be fine at this point. We just want to ensure that we are able to keep those processes in place, saying mostly probably gonna be fine, but everything is going to go through the same review, and some material may be flagged.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I think just describe what you've done already, and then what you're going to do.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, and Michael, if you can, I mean, quantifying it with even a range of percentage, like when you say small percent, like qualify that with like 1 to 5% of the materials or something, so that the reviewers understand what you mean when you say small percent, will be useful.
Gotcha, thanks. I'll have to look into that part of it. Thank you. Yeah,
and as we said last week, or not last week, but last time, whenever that was, about estimates for collections. I mean, our reviewers know that if you're upfront and honest with the work that you've done, and you say this is an estimate, we're not going to hold you to that number in any sort of way. It's more just to have a sense of, for some of these collections, it will be all of the materials that are affected by rights and ethical considerations. For you, it sounds like it's going to be a very small percentage, and that's what they want to know. I think too, if anybody else wants to jump on and ask a question over the microphone or turn on your videos, we welcome that as well in this time.
Just a, can you hear me? It's Lynn Elwood.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll go out on a limb here. In terms of redaction, so those of you that have more experience, you know, how is it assessed when a document, when an artifact, when something becomes, when it loses its I guess its overall aim or purpose because of redaction or trying to address some sensitivities? I know it's a general question, but I just wondered if people had experience with redaction and its effectiveness.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of experience with redaction, you know, because being in various situations where we're mandated to do it, and then being in situations where we want to do it to respect things that, you know, may be in records that the people who have intellectual property relationship to, or even just like an an existing a relationship of being to, didn't consent to it being there. You know, well, and I guess, you know, leading into the second case, there's just situations where things shouldn't have been there in the first place. You know, just to take an obvious example, a description of a ceremony. And oftentimes, you know, like if it makes it to a government record, or it's in the letter from a, you know, a missionary or an inspector, or a government teacher who's not informed about the community, a lot of the times the information is distorted. You know, there's oftentimes something grotesque about it, so that it's not as if you can, you know, you're not losing the knowledge of the thing because it's not properly represented anyway. But you're also not, you know, perpetuating it. Yeah, and you know, and for some of those things, for things, you know, that are you know, meant not to be seen. I gave an analog one time to somebody working on a digitization project from Russian Orthodox context. I'm not native. I'm you know, from the Detroit Slavs, you know, but my kids are tribal citizens, so I have to think about these things a lot. You know, and in the Russian Orthodox, you know, there's like whole parts of the ceremony that the people sitting in the church, they don't get to see. Like the priests, like, you know, go behind this, you know, gate for a while and do some other things there and all that kind of thing. And it's not, you know, it's not lessened for anybody in the church because it's, you know, it's not the thing that we're supposed to see. It's like this other tier of, you know, information. You know, so I just try and think about different things to, you know, it kind of expands my knowledge about people having relationships to information. You know, there's a lot that's very genuine in that, and it's worth thinking through. And for straight up, you know, kind of privacy redacting, you know, sometimes we would going through somebody's case file, and you know, sometimes you're protecting that person's privacy. Sometimes you're redacting something to protect the privacy of somebody who's mentioned in the record, who may not even be aware that they're in this government document. You know, it can be frustrating. You know, there would very often be, you know, there's oftentimes people are waiting, they're waiting for records to come open so they can go through a bulk of records. Or in some instances, there have been, you know, researchers that have entered into protocols where they can examine a series of records with guarantees of protecting privacy and that kind of thing. So there's ways of working with it to meet goals of access and just try to protect people's rights. But I'll let the other folks speak to it.
Sounds
Yeah.
as messy as I imagined. That's what I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
it's messy. And I think, Lynn, it's hard to say how our reviewers will handle it with the new iteration of the program. We've de-emphasized access a bit in favor of this community-centered access notion. So I think it's important, if you're going to include redaction as part of your access plan, that you just take the time to thoroughly explain it, to justify your reasoning, to leave none of those, well, why are you doing this questions for the reviewers. And I think, I mean, as Anna said, I mean, redaction is a tool that is used for access. It's an acceptable thing. It's just explaining what you're doing and what you're redacting, I think, will be important.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Will, your video's on. Do you have something to add?
Thank you. I had a question. It might have been addressed. I had to step out for a second, so I apologize if it's already been addressed. But it's about, you know, I'm going to be digitizing a program that aired a lot of third-party content, and they don't have the original content or the original contracts, but you know, they were never litigated back then for using for using this content. I think a lot of the times it was used, you know, extra legally. And a lot of it was because it was just imported movies or imported television or something like that. So my question is, how risk averse do we have to be in working with this kind of material, especially when a lot of the footage that is imported is already like posted on YouTube, for example, without any official licensing. So it's the region, the Middle East, North Africa tends to be more lax in terms of intellectual property from a legal perspective. Do I, you know, in the application, is this something that's necessary to explain as background? Do we have to have a firm decision on this?
I think this ties into a question that we had in chat about other types of third-party copyrighted material and the potential risk of violating copyright. We have found that our reviewers are very open to well-considered risk. I think that it has to be explained. Explain the research that you've done, explain the risks that you are open to take, the support from your organization for that risk, and then also have that policy, a takedown policy, or some other mechanism in place if your right to use the material is challenged in any way.
Yeah, and you know, that question in the chat asks, is a takedown policy an approach that will be considered by the panel, or is it too risky? Do they simply want to know that we have a policy and approach to third-party copyright? Like Joy was saying, I think it's acceptable to them often as long as it's very well explained. And the rights, ethics, and reuse question that we mentioned is one of the only sections in the application where you can attach additional appendices. So I would encourage you to share any documentation you have like that takedown policy that might help them understand how you would handle it.
I don't know, Anna, if you had any reflections on the risk factor in terms of how you balance that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, what I'm hearing for the folks that are asking, it looks like they're, I hear that you're, you know, very carefully evaluating the material and, you know, you're developing an approach that seems quite well in line with it.
Are there any other questions? We did want to share that the collections list is the other component of the application that this session addresses, and we have a couple samples of that component on our apply for an award page now. I don't know if Joy wants to say anything more about them, but they sort of, I'll let you go through it, Joy.
Yes, so those were just posted today, hot off the presses. We wanted to get them online for you in time for this webinar so we could tell you all about them. But the list of collections is kind of the upload component that is a bridge between when you're talking and describing your materials, and then when you start to think about rights, ethics, and reuse of those materials. And we had a question through email in these last couple weeks where we made this link much more apparent, and we did want to make sure that we shared it with the whole group, not just the person that asked the question. There's a column in the list of collections where you are asked, will any reusage restrictions apply? And it's a simple yes or no question. And in considering that and considering whether you need to click yes or no for your collections, a yes will mean that you are likely to check one or more of the boxes. There's a checklist of different restrictions that's included in the project details, rights, ethics, and reuse task. And so those include things like if you're planning to restrict to any particular user group, like we've talked about, if you're thinking that you will charge any sort of fees for commercial purposes, or if you're going to use tools like the local context notes or some other marker in your metadata that will help to guide access to these materials. So anything on that checklist that you're thinking about that you'll apply to any portion of the collections that you're listing in list of collections, you'll select yes. If you select no, that means that what you're proposing to digitize, to the best of your knowledge, you've determined that there are no legal or ethical concerns, and that the risk is so low that you're not going to widely apply any sort of restrictions to access. So the sample that we posted online that will be most useful is the Bethel Broadcasting list of collections. And we'll be sure that the link is shared widely. But that one was proposing to digitize materials from a public radio station, and it contained a lot of indigenous language materials, some of which they thought at the time when they were applying could have included any like ceremonial content, language that needed to be restricted based on season, or some of those other traditional knowledge labels that we talked about earlier. And so in that sample, I've made note of the particular boxes then that they would have gone on to check in the rights, ethics, and reuse task. It's a lot of words for something that we hope is actually linking these things together as you're starting to think more thoroughly through your whole digitization project.
Yeah, and the last bit of info that I think may be useful is that we have 2 dedicated IP reviewers, rights ethics and reuse reviewers on the panel. And it's sort of, it's useful to know that they're really looking to see whether the plan is viable in context with the other reviewers' evaluation. So it's sort of a conversation where the other reviewers will say, you know, it seems like there may be some information in here that is sensitive. Does the plan make sense? Does their rights, ethics, and reuse statement make sense to you? And the IP reviewers sort of have that final call to say, this needs more work. I don't think it's fundable right now. Or, you know, this has a solid plan. I may make a few suggestions to help encourage them to really get where they need to go, but overall it's fine. So there's sort of, that's the back end process of the reason you're preparing this statement. So if you have any questions about that review process, we're happy to answer them too. All right. I've not
We thought
seen-
that you all would have a lot more questions than this, to be honest.
You can always hit us up by email if any more come to mind as you actually get into it. So I guess we'll end there.
Yeah, we need to pop up our slides and finish out the presentation.
Still processing, that's good. It's all about the process.
All right, so there were a lot of resources that were offered today that I hope you'll check out. I think thinking about your project with Anna's context in mind, with a lot of those Native American protocols, you know, there is such care that has gone into that entire system that adopting that for any digitization project is really helpful. Our next session is on designing an achievable, sustainable digitization plan, and it will take place September 30th at 2 p.m. So I hope you will sign up for that if that sounds like it would be of interest. And we have one last quick poll follow-up to the one that we did at the start, and it's exactly the same. So please take that before you head out. And huge thanks to Anna for helping us with this session today.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Looks like all the results have come through. Thank you all so much and have a good afternoon.